I don't think there could be a more perfect match with the reading today and my message today. You know, Ted Turner said this: if I only had a little humility, I'd be perfect. On a scale to 10, 1 to 10, where would you put yourself? Really think about that. How vain are we? How much of our life is surrounding us? How much would you say in your personal life that vanity or pride plays a part? You know, because I think that if we ask ourselves and we think that we're okay in this department, we are probably a little off target. Because I see life itself as a really long learning lesson to overcome this issue and to develop humility. That's what I think our whole life is going to be about, really. You know, there was a high-level evangelist that flew out to one of the congregations a while back, and he was going to speak there, and the people were so excited that he had come, and it was a big day, and there was a lot of excitement in the air, and the people couldn't wait for him. Well, the day finally came, and the evangelist arrived, and he gave his message, and he felt pretty good about it. He felt pretty good about what he had preached, and he was greeting people after the service, and most of the people seemed very gracious and very accepting of what he was bringing to them that day. But then there was an elderly woman that came up to him, and she said, you know, she apparently didn't agree too much. She went up to him and said, way too long, way too long. The evangelist was kind of speechless at hearing this, and others, of course, around had heard her, and they gathered around to see his reaction, and then they heard her say, well, it was way too loud. You know, he just spoke way too loud. And he was becoming just a little bit nervous about this point and trying to maintain his composure at the time. And she said, besides that, it was just plain boring, you know. And at that point, one of the deacons came over, and he was going to help out over there. And he spoke to the evangelist. He said, you know, don't take her remarks really seriously. That's Mrs. Smith over there, and she kind of has memory problems and so on. So don't pay any attention to her. She's just a little senile, and she goes around through the congregation, and she just repeats everything she hears everybody else say. You can imagine how that went over. You can imagine how embarrassed the evangelist who prided himself on being someone of importance might have felt at the time. But why would it be embarrassing? Really, why? It's just pride. That's what it is. It is in so many cases. And I really appreciate how this is going to link into James' reading today. You know, but this thing of pride really is at the heart of our human nature. It really is, and every one of us, I believe, are burdened, you might say, by this trait. And it is, on the other hand, humility that is going to help us become more and more like God. You know, pride was what changed the angels to devils. Pride is what makes men and women sometimes act like animals. And it is humility that is going to help us become like God. Frank Leahy put it this way, and I want you to listen to this very carefully because it says an awful lot more than just the words on the paper. He wrote, egotism is the anesthetic that dulls the pain of our foolishness. That's what our ego does. It protects us from our own foolishness by thinking we're okay, you know. And I think it plays an enormous part in our salvation, this thing of humility. So let's go over to Isaiah 57. Isaiah 57, because if we don't get this one right, we're not going to get it. We will not get it. Isaiah 57, verse 15, Isaiah 57, 15, for thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him also that's of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. That's the point. That's who he's going to dwell with. Do you think he's going to dwell with Saddam Hussein? Do you think he's going to dwell with some of these terrorist leaders like the one in Korea? No. He's going to dwell with the people that are humble and who are cooperative and who work together and who listen to one another. That's the kind of people he's going to live with. And so that's why he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, as we read earlier. Theirs is the kingdom of God. That's what it's going to take to be in the kingdom of God. And I think it makes it really clear. We desire to be in that kingdom, but this is the key. This is the doorway that is going to enable us to be a part of that kingdom. It is the thing that's going to enable us to hear the messages that we have on Sabbath, that are going to hear the words that are in God's Bible and pay attention to them and not just gloss over them. Oh, I know that. Because there's different levels, and as we mature in life, it has more and more and deeper meaning. And so, when it says that the poor in spirit, it's not talking about the poor in God's spirit, of course, but it's talking about those who don't think they're better than others. It's talking about those who are not arrogant in their presentation of themselves, not vain, not puffed up. And it's those who don't act like it's only them that count. Only their ideas count. Genesis 1, if you will. I don't want you to get me wrong here and just look at this one-sided, because there is this a right to feel good about yourself and about what you've done. And so there is a proper satisfaction to doing a job well, to have produced something of value. There is a reason to feel good about that, as we see here in Genesis 1 and verse 31. Genesis 1, verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And so you get the point here is that there's nothing wrong with that kind of pride in workmanship, that kind of just feeling good about, I did it right, I did it the right way, I made it good, you know. God was pleased with his work, and there's no reason why we can't be. It was a true statement, that's all. But his head wasn't all swelled up like, hey, everybody, look what I did, aren't I great, you know? It wasn't that kind of approach. So let's go to Job 32 for a minute. Job 32. That's an interesting one. You know, have you, I think we all have, met people who think that everything they say is the truth, the gospel truth, as it were, and they think they're always right, no matter what. And boy, I tell you, I've met a number of those in my trek. So anyway, just think about it for a minute. I'm going to have to think about it for 2 minutes while I search for Job here. Okay. Every one of us have met someone like this who thinks that, they call them know-it-alls because they think that they know everything, you know, and it doesn't make any difference what the topic is. They have an answer and they can wax eloquent on it, but they very rarely listen to others. But then I found people who listen very carefully to what others say, and they do so that they can construct their argument against it. They're not listening to try to understand where you're coming from. They're listening very carefully so they can make an argument against what you're saying, because they have to be right. They're convinced they have all the answers. And so consider Job. What do you do in these cases? Consider Job. And in this case, what was his friend's reaction? Well, they said in verse 32 and verse 1, so these men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. That's all you can do. That's about the only choice we have. So let's go over to Proverbs 6 also. Proverbs 6. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. God says there that he hates vanity, and he's not really too hesitant about saying it. In verse 16, through 19, he says something I think of real interest. In verse 16, there's 6 things does the Lord hate. Yes, 7 are an absolute abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imagination, and feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that sows discord among brethren. Now I ask you to think about these words for a minute, because it's my belief that every single one of those actions or traits, they emanate from the pride itself. So he hates the pride, but he hates this, and this, because they all are like one. He categorizes them in one category because they're all like one, that they all stem from this thing called pride. Pride promotes itself, even before God. And we all do this. It doesn't consult God before it makes the decisions that we make in life, and it puts itself before others. It's often characterized by selfishness, stubbornness, and it will often substitute its will for the will of God. And in the end, it harms us, and it harms everyone around us. And you know, it was really interesting today that Pearson was the student who shot the other student. And you know what the reason was that he shot the other student? He was trying to shoot the teacher because the teacher had demoted him in the speech class, in the debate class. A demotion in speech class when you're a young kid. You understand what's happened? We have taken so much government money, so much of your tax money, and we've put it into millions of dollars into programs to build self-esteem so that people think they really are good. You can't tell them you missed the point. You didn't get the good grade. You can't tell them. They get angry enough to shoot someone. We've done ourselves a terrible disservice by not putting the truth as precedent, you know. Proverbs 16 may start with pride, but it ends out falling from God's calling. Every time. This is so wrong. You know, Terry said, we're just renting here. I love that. You know, we're just renting here. You know, who are we? You know, we're just tenants here, you know. We don't even really own anything. We're going to die and leave it. You know, it's just ridiculous. You know, Proverbs 16:18. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And that's going to happen to any and every single one of us. If we think that we are somebody, watch out, because we are going to fall. It just leads in that direction every time. You know, we don't fit with the rest of the world. Proverbs 11. Pride ultimately will bring with us attendant shame. Proverbs 11 and verse 2. When pride comes, then comes shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. And so every one of us has seen someone who thought they were really something. And then all they need is one mistake, you know, and everybody is just laughing at them and mocking them because we all hate, just like God does. We hate an arrogant spirit when it's in somebody else. Well, we don't when it's in us. We don't even see it, and that's because the pride itself will cover it up. Just like Leahy said, you know, it's just an anesthetic for the pain of seeing the reality of ourselves. Proverbs 26. Proverbs 26 and verse 12. Do you see a man wise in his own conceit? There is more hope of a fool than him. Wise in his own conceit. He's just going to keep going his own way, right off the cliff if necessary. Don't tell me, I already know. what I'm doing, you know. And then let's go to James and read again what we read during the message today, which I thought was, is profound. I think this whole chapter is really profound. James 4 and 13 through 16. How many times do we do this? How many times in the company that we work for have we been in meetings and we've set out, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do the other. And, in all these meetings where they design new cars, new motorcycles, new ways of doing things, and they're going to bring this out on the market, they're going to make millions, And he says, go to now, you that say today or tomorrow we'll go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and we'll get gain. Whereas you know not what you shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It's just a vapor. And if you think about it in the context of all human history, if you ever put one of those kettles on the fire and then it shoots out a little stream of vapor and then it just disappears and we are there for a while and then we disappear. How could we possibly think we were anything important, A vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. And I believe that we should say that, and we shouldn't mock it. We shouldn't make it, as some people do, a part of their constant vocabulary so that you think that they're religious. But instead, mean it. Mean it. This is what I'd like to do, and if God's willing, then we'll get it done, But boy, if he's not willing, we're fighting against the immovable. So Abraham Lincoln gave his speech that's very famous, but in it he said something, and I just wonder if we get it, and it's so beautifully put. I want to read it, if you'll let me. We've been the recipients, he said, of the choicest bounties of heaven. We've been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We've grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. Does it make sense? We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated, drunk, he says, on our success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of God's grace, too proud to pray to the God who made us. Man, that describes us today even more than it was then. But he saw it starting, and I'm going, this man had brilliant insight to be able to say that, to realize it, I know he learned to read, using the Bible, but he knew it. He knew what that Bible was talking about, and he made a great point. So pride deceives our very own heart. But how many people heard him, understood him, and how many people changed because of it? I say precious few do. Ezekiel 28. Because we have a story in this Bible that is a chronology of spirit's and man's life. And in verse 14 of Ezekiel 28, it started with Lucifer. You are the anointed cherub that covers, and I've set you so. You were upon the holy mountain of God, and you walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. And you were perfect in your ways from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. But by the multitude of merchandise, they filled the midst of you with violence. Did you ever think about that? Merchandising? That Satan was merchandising. He was leveraging his position up to where he had everything, where he owned it all. And that's what we're doing today. That's what the big high-wheeler dealers in Wall Street and what the real estate people do. They're trying to leverage it up. They're merchandising. They're sending ads on television every few minutes to get you to buy their product. And it all becomes about things and not about principles. and not about truth. And you have sinned as a result, and therefore I'll cast you as profane out of the mountain of God, and I'll destroy you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty, and you have corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness. Now look how many women actually have had to go into rehab who have become beautiful and were told they were beautiful and had a role of being beautiful. It all goes to their head and it destroys a person. It just destroys them. You know, every one of us, I found in life, is beautiful in our own way. We really are, you know, and we should see that. But this is what happens to these people. I'll cast you, he says, to the ground, and I'll lay you before kings that they may behold thee. That is the future of this gorgeous, powerful, and beautiful spirit being, because he let it go to his head. His pride led him to think, I can be number one in the universe. Kind of a high standard there. But it almost seems unthinkable that someone could be that proud to us. But yet, look at it. We see it in the politics. And we see it in the nations all around us. Everybody wants to climb to the top. And just recently now, China put a barricade of ships out and tried to stop a U.S. destroyer. It was in international waters. They just want to show their power. We can do this. We can push America around the way we want to, you know. Well, we avoided that. But my point is that every nation. I remember when I was in college and I was reading about these various empires, Babylon and Persia and Greece and so on in Rome. And I remember just the guy in Persia, the Persian king, he was taxing his people so that they could barely live, so he could build his army, because he wanted to take Babylon. He wanted to be the top dog. And I'm thinking of the fathers and the sons and the mothers and their lives, all existing for this one man's purpose, which was to be on top. You know, that's satanic, you know. But that's our corporations today, too. They want to be on top. They want the most money, and that's the national movement that's going on. That's what Saddam Hussein was trying to do, and that's what Iran's trying to do. They want to get the bomb so they can be on top, you know. It's horrible. It's a horrible thing that we have inside every one of us. You know, so anyway, this is also borne out in the history of God's people. And you remember in the book of Judges, and we move along here, that after Joshua and Caleb and those guys and Moses had died, then they had a period of the judges. And you remember what was said about them? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Anarchy. Cutting that girl up and sending her parts all over the nation. How sick. How sick. But we're no different today. We are no different, you know. So the people rejected God as their king. They wanted a human king so that they could look like others and be a respectable nation and so on. And he warned the people, you know. But they clamored for a king. So God gave them Saul as their king. He starts out like a pretty nice guy. He's humble. Let's go to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel. And verse 15, or chapter 15, I'm sorry. And so now he starts humble, and so he looks like a good candidate. But once he has the crown, once he is a king, once he has power, he immediately begins to misuse it. Immediately. And so what he does is he offers the offering that Samuel was supposed to offer, you know. And then he doesn't kill Agag. He doesn't kill him, and he takes the best of the spoil for himself. And he starts doing the opposite of what God says, because he was important in his own eyes. In verse 17, and Samuel said, when you were little in your own sight, were you not made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a journey and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed? Wherefore then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, But you didn't fly upon the spoil. You did fly upon the spoil. Fly upon it, Let's get as much as we can get. Let's get as much as we can get, And you did evil in the sight of the Lord. And Saul said to Samuel, yeah, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord, and I've gone the way which the Lord sent me. And I brought Agag the king and Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took the spoil, and the sheep and the oxen, and the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed to sacrifice to the Lord in Gilgal. And Samuel said, hath the Lord so great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, or in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion, think about that. When we sin, you ever think about that? It's rebellion. And what's motivating it? Our own will, our own pride, is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry, because you've rejected the word of the Lord. Then he has rejected you from being king. And we have a destiny to be kings and priests, and to hold the highest positions in the kingdom. And how can we do that if we let pride dictate our actions? How can we be that? We can't be that. That's why I say this is so vital to our Christian growth and our destiny. You'd think that the reprimand would have turned Saul around. It would deflate him. Instead, pride turned him into a murderer, where he would seek David's life because David was a threat to him. And I say again and again and again, and I say it as a man of experience. In other words, I've done this, so I know how it works. It's the same thing that causes us to sin. We think we can make an excuse that God will accept. We think that our thoughts are as good enough that we can justify what we're doing. And God says it's rebellion. And we're going, well, yeah, but, and then we give our excuse. It comes from our own pride. Who are we to think we can say, well, God, there's, extenuating circumstances here, I can sin. Same every time we sin in our life. Daniel 4. May not be murder, or it may not be that we are out torturing people like some in the world do, but Daniel 4, is it possible, I say this sincerely, is it possible that if given the opportunity, we might be as evil as some of those people we think are evil, but we just haven't had the opportunity? Well, look, here's somebody that had the opportunity. It was Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 28, all this came upon Nebuchadnezzar. And at the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon, and the king spoke, and he said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by my might and my power, and for the honor of my majesty? Amazing. While the word was in his mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whoever he will. So you understand my point is Nebuchadnezzar thought, oh, aren't I great, because look at this great Babylon that I have made. Okay? So he thinks he's great by all this, but how did he make Babylon great? He did it by killing, making war with smaller nations, weaker nations, and torturing them, and stealing the best of the best that they had, and bringing them, just like he brought Daniel as one of the princes into his, people who were his advisors, and he brought the best talent from all the other nations. He raped them, you know. Oh, look at this great Babylon that I've built. You know, people don't think about all the people they're hurting. They don't think about it. 10 years the Prince of Persia taxed them out of existence so he could be number one. So he had built mighty Babylon by killing and hurting others. And because of this, God said, you're going to be turned into a beast. Why do you think he did that? Because Nebuchadnezzar was a beast. He had turned himself into a beast. That's how God sees us when we act like this. When we just rip and tear and we grab for whatever we want. You're acting like a beast, not a human being made in the image of God. So let's go to Proverbs again. Let's go to 18. Proverbs 18. Look at this great Babylon I've made. Can't believe. So the point is, when we are ruled by our own ego, by our own vanity, we become as beasts in the eyes of God. And there is a lesson here for every one of us to learn, and that is this. We hate trials, don't we? We don't want them. We want to be comfortable. You know, we want people to look up to us. We want to be important in other people's eyes. But, again, in Proverbs 18 and verse 12, it says, before destruction the heart of man is haughty, but before honor is humility. God has an amazing honor for each and every one of those people that follow his word. Each and every one of us is going to have honor beyond our imagination. We will be shocked, and it will be jaw-dropping when we stand before his throne and he does in our body and gives us what he intends to give us. It's going to be more wonderful than we could ever believe, more wonderful than Nebuchadnezzar could ever imagine. But first has to come this one thing, humility in dealing with one another in this world. So the church today and the government that we live under are in an enormous crisis, aren't they? Both of them are. And I say it all stems from this lack of humility. Everyone, it seems, is filled with pride. No one can be wrong. No one's listening to anybody else's criticism. No one wants to take any orders. And today, out in the world, there are more wars than we've seen for such a long time. They're all seeking independence. And so we get a people, then a nation, and they throw out the old leader and they bring in the new leader. And how long does it take before they're dissatisfied with him and they want to throw him out and put somebody else in? It's just over and over and over. What a waste. You know, but my point is that the same mentality is happening in the churches of God, and it's happening in the marriages of God. You know, we're not satisfied with the guy who's leading the thing, and we want to do it our way. And so if he won't do it our way, we're going to go start our own. And then you see a split and another split, and then you see another one. And I can't believe it. Last time I looked, there was, including the small ones, our friends here, including the small ones, there's 360 some splits from one church. So what do you think made that happen? Trying to serve God with all their heart? Or they wanted to do it their way. You know, you can't bend to somebody else. You know, I'm telling you that almost anybody's way would work if we all got behind it and worked it, you know. It would work, even if it was an inferior plan to ours. It would still work if we all backed it up, you know. This is ridiculous what's going on, and ridiculous in marriage. Who stays together until death does us part? You know, it's ego. We don't want to submit to one another, you know, or we demand our way until somebody can't stand it anymore and they leave, you know. The business world is getting harder to work with one another in many places. Bosses expect people to bend to their word because he's the boss, right? Because he's the boss, not because he's really good at what he does, not because he's leading you by showing you by example how to work, but because he has a title, you know, a boss. So anyway, people underneath, they badmouth the boss, you know, certain that they know better. And everyone wants to be number one. I remember that song that was out I used to love listening to, and it's everybody wants to rule the world, Oh, no, I don't want to rule it. Just this, and then this, and then this, and more, never satisfied, Anyway, Leonard Bernstein was the most famous of the orchestra conductors, and a fan asked him one time, he said, what is the most difficult instrument to play? And he said, oh, that's easy, second fiddle. Second fiddle's the hardest one. He says, I can get plenty of first violinists, but I can't get one who plays the second violin with enthusiasm. Or second French horn or second flute. Now that's my problem, he says. If no one plays second, we can't have harmony. Got it? You can't all be number one. In other words, it's crazy, when you think about it. But so much of this, I think, is ruining our life in America as people are trying to take more and more, spend more and more, raise the debt ceiling more and more, take more and more lobby money. It's ruining the life of the church, the power, the need for power, and have a really big church, big with a B. It's been said. We're going to have a big church, What about we're going to obey God, with a big O, What's wrong with that? Before Moses could lead God's people, he had to learn to lead sheep. And I think it was an interesting lesson for him because he thought he was to be the one. He thought he was the one, and that's why he killed that other man. Before Joseph became the leader in Egypt, he had to be a slave and suffer first. Before David could be king, he was hunted down as if he was some sort of crook. Paul was blinded, and then they sent him to Tarsus for 13 years before we see the church sending him down as an apostle. He had to prove himself working as a member in the church, and then maybe later raised up to an office of responsibility. But it was 13 years before we see him appearing in the middle of the book of Acts again. He just disappears for a while, and then he comes back. But over time, Paul wrote this: we ought not think of ourselves better than others. Well, that's a good basic idea, Good idea. Because of this, often we're better in some ways, but then they're better in other ways. Who are we to say one's better than the other, It's really funny that we do this. So I say for this reason, it's okay to suffer loss in this life. Our human nature doesn't like it. It resists and it bristles about it, but it teaches us humility. It teaches us humility to accept God's leadership and believe in what he's doing in our life without it being added up in dollar bills or something. It's okay to lose. There's a time to lose. And that's usually the time we make our best growth. It really is. So my point is, just like everybody else in the Bible that we read of, the great heroes of faith, before we can be kings and priests, we have to be able to lose. We have to be tested in our life. We've got to have trials, and sometimes it means we got to be on the bottom of the pile for a while, So Christ had to feel what other people feel in order to be able to be a high priest for them. He had to do that. And so I'm asking us to put this in the context of all of our lives, How do you learn compassion if you don't ever suffer? How can you ever feel for the other person if you haven't hurt sometime, We're here to learn that. Compassion, not just power and authority. And I'm not being one-sided in this because I know people with their DNA sometimes, everybody's different. You inherit from one side of your parents more than the other. And sometimes you inherit what they call a high ego. And sometimes your DNA produces a lower ego. So the higher ego tends to overestimate themselves or overvalue themselves. The low ego tends to minimize their abilities and stuff like that. But my point is today, neither one of those makes a single tiny bit of difference in our lives, whether you're high or low or however you're born, because the issue isn't thinking less of ourselves, it's thinking less about ourselves, thinking more about God and His way. Get out of the way, whether you're high ego or low ego. It doesn't matter. You're still carnal and you still want to protect yourself and you still want what's best for you, but He knows exactly what we need. And so getting in line with Him, getting in line with the Spirit of God and following God's way, however it works out, is always going to be good. All things work together for good for those who love God. Can we trust that? Yes, we can. And must. And must. We must trust that. So, it's not how we're made or who we are or anything. It's being an objective observer in this life and not taking things personally, being a tenant. I just love that. We're a tenant, Yeah, that's kind of neat. Think about this. Love our neighbor as ourselves. We all know we're supposed to do that. How do we do that? How do we do it? Because there is no respect of others without humility. Can you see what I'm saying? There is no respect for others if we don't have humility. 1 Peter 5. First Peter 5 and verse 5. Likewise, you younger, submit yourselves to the elder. Yes, all of you be subject to one another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. So as was explained earlier, grace is the impact that God has in our life, His influence in our mind, and how we then act as a result. That is grace. And you use it, and they use it, that term, like a person was very graceful, and we should be spiritually graceful, toward one another. It's really, I think, important to be like that. So, it's a major key to Christianity. Let's go to James 4, and we'll reread that was read today. The doorway to the kingdom. You have the key if you have humility. And God is going to give us enormous power like He Himself wields in the universe. But He must be assured, and we must ensure Him that it's not going to go to our heads like it did with Lucifer. And this is why God says first in 4:10, He says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord so that He can lift you up when the time comes. That's what we've got to do, Here's another quote from Lincoln. I've been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day. Ever run up against a wall? Things just, you don't know what you're going to do, I mean, I know I did that with Judy this year. We went down to the bottom of the pile there, and I thought it was, I got a month. I got a month to go, and everything turned around. Everything turned around. She's not well, but she's way better. She is way better. We were able to go out a little bit yesterday, and financially we're made the turn, and we're doing okay. But I thought, well, blah 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 blah. That was going to happen. If that's God's will, it's God's will. It's really okay, because I know I'll learn something from it. I'll be better for it in the end. It really is okay to lose. There's a time for that, and that was my time, and hers as well. And so, before we conclude today, though, I want to make another point that I think should be addressed. There's probably nothing more deceitful than the appearance of humility. Nothing more deceitful than the appearance of humility. If you have not read Evidence for Errors, I'm asking you, please read it, because it is so eye-opening when you do, that the Old Testament is a parallel to the New Testament. They had 7 eras back there, and the last era then was that of the Pharisees. The last era for us is the one we're living in right now. And we can see the parallels. What they had to deal with, what they needed to overcome, is what we need to overcome. So what they did was they made God's word be what they wanted. And they did everything that they did to be seen of men. And it was all vanity. And that's what we've got to worry about at the end of the age. Realize this. They were proud not to be considered like other men. They fasted. They tithed. They did those things that church people do. And they were zealous about it in their church. But they were mean and hard-hearted. They were vanity and filled with pride. They were disgusting to Christ, and he constantly condemned them. And he condemns the era at the age for the same thing, because they haven't learned humility. They haven't learned to humble themselves and simply follow the word of God and be successful in it. False humility. Theirs was a false humility, and they boasted of their pride. And they thought they were better than others. It was all a vain show. We've got to see this, and so I'm asking you, if you haven't read this, read it so you can see what it is we need to overcome at the end of the age. Because some people think it's just zeal, but they had zeal, for their church, not for God. Okay? Zeal for the church, zeal for being noticed in church, zeal for being ordained in the church. That's the kind of zeal we have for the most part. But obeying God, that's a different thing. But being noticed, being seen, being somebody, man, we've got to just shy away from that. And we feel the tugs. They're going to come because it's in us. It's part of our human nature. You're going to feel the tug. Resist it. Resist it. Because God resists the proud. You should resist the proud. So anyway, humility is not thinking or acting less than others. It is thinking less about ourselves and more about God and others. And I tell you the truth, from what I know of it, it is so liberating. You don't have anything to uphold. You don't have to be anybody. You don't have to act a certain way. You don't have to please the masses. You don't have to do any of that if you're pleasing God. It just doesn't matter. So anyway, at the end, men are striving to build this temple for God, and he says, where's the temple you're going to build me? And in Isaiah 66. So my point is, if you want approval, if you want attention, if you want to be somebody who could be bigger than somebody that God noticed and said, this guy's cool. This guy's doing it right, And so he says in Isaiah 66 and verse 1, thus says the Lord, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where's the house you'll build unto me, and where's the place of my rest? For all those things has my hand made. You maybe fix your car and think you're a hero. His hand has made everything that it's made of. And all those things have been, said the Lord. But you want your recognitions fulfilled? Your recognition needs? Your approval needs? You want that? Listen, but to this man, and let me include this woman, will I look, even to him that is a poor and of a contrite spirit and trembles at my word. So this is where we can get the recognition needs filled. He recognizes what we're doing for his sake, and we see that his way is the right way, and we can have a true estimation of our own value and righteousness, and we can tremble as we consider his, who is magnificent. It's a story to me that indicates somewhat how we should live as God's children. There was a first grade class, and in the first grade class, the teacher introduced a fun game for the kids. It was called the balloon stomp. And you can imagine how much fun the kids would have with this. A balloon was tied to every children's ankle. And the object was to pop the other's balloon without getting your balloon popped. And the last person that had a balloon inflated was the winner. So the teacher introduced the game and everyone had a complete chaotic time, and they all enjoyed it, of course, and the guy with the balloon was the winner, and he was the big guy for the day. So anyway, she told a friend of hers who was another teacher, and only she was teaching handicapped children, and she thought, well, I'll try that game with them. And so anyway, the teacher introduced it and taught these handicapped kids. They were given the same exact explanation in the class, but they got the signal, it seems like, to begin, but maybe it didn't process perfectly. But the game went a little differently. They knew that the balloons were supposed to be popped. But in their minds, they thought the balloons were the enemy. It couldn't possibly be one of the other people. So what they would do is they would help each other pop their balloons. So one little girl gets down there and holds this boy, or holds her balloon just like, a football kicker holder, for the football. She would hold it for him, and then he'd come along and hit it, and then they would trade positions, and the other one would do it for the other one, until they did it until all the balloons were popping, and the kids were just going, yay! They had all done the right thing, but they helped each other. They didn't have the guile that you and I sometimes experience. They didn't have the need to be the number one winner that everybody could look up to and see. And that, I think, is how we should begin living our lives. In the world, the people think along the balloon popping game, they think that if they can pop everybody else's balloon, or if they pop a balloon, that leaves a position for them to move into, and it's just this thing of pride leading us to want to be number one again. And instead of helping one another and being a family, that's what God is raising, is a family. So we're going to help each other. None of us are the enemy. Some people are misled by Satan, but we will reconcile in the end with them in the second resurrection. We're going to bring them into the family too. But we've got to be able to set an example that they can look back on and say, oh yeah, I remember you, because we're going to be working with people who knew us, people of our race, people of our culture, people of our background, and it is a godlike privilege to be able to help another person. And so I'm saying, what are we doing gossiping? What are we doing tearing others down? We should be helping others to achieve our calling, And Christ put us first when he was on the earth, didn't he? All that he suffered, that he went through. What was he thinking? I'm going to be great after this. He was thinking, look how many people are going to benefit from this. And it's worth it to suffer this way and to be this low and to be spit on and to be beaten until he was unrecognizable. He put us first. Now that he is in heaven next to the Father's right hand, it's our turn to put him first. And so we are to love and help one another. And I say, let's go ahead and start working on this while we still have time.